let's start off first. I'd be interested in not a question of words, but Rich talked about the Jewish voice, and Riv-Ellen talked about a Jewish voice, many Jewish voices. So I'm wondering if you two feel like you are arguing in conflict. Rich, you want to go first?
Actually, I don't think that's the point we're in conflict on.
Okay, then what is?
I don't believe in a singular voice in anything. I mean, our public square is made up of many voices. We're a pluralistic society, and I think too often we get this notion that we're seeking harmony when in fact I think what we're really trying to seek is the exchange of ideas, as Larry was talking about. I actually think where there might be some conflict is that Riv, if I understood you correctly, was saying let's gather up our allies and fight our fight and see if we can win through the exercise of power. And my point of view is, just to join an argument here, my point of view is that we face a fundamental choice in our country. We can stay on the path of the status quo, where we try to divvy up the public square and win by dint of the power of our voice, the power of our money, the power of our crowd. Or we can choose an alternate path of possibility and hope, where we actually have a greater exchange of ideas, where we make a commitment to see and hear one another, where we afford people not simply respect but dignity, where we work from a point of view of shared responsibility, that we can't go it alone on our own, that we need each other. And I think to take that path requires us to engage with a different kind of intentionality, a different mindset, and a different set of practices if we want to make progress in the public square together.
Riv-Ellen.
So 2 points, largely speaking as a social scientist, meaning looking at how the world is. And here are the 2 points I would make. I think it's a tremendous problem to ever say that there is the Jewish anything. For multiple decades, scholars have really referred to Judaisms and American Judaisms as well. And if we can acknowledge that pluralism, that's very important, and to understand there are significant differences. So what interests me, of course, I'm very moved by what you spoke about and very taken with it and valued it very much. But what I'm thinking about is a most recent study in Wisconsin shows that 4,000 voters were not allowed to exercise their vote. That was much more likely to happen to African American voters than white voters. 4,000 votes would have been the difference between how the state of Wisconsin went. 40,000 voters elected Donald Trump in 3 states. And every time I hear, and I say this with sincerity, the inspiring things that you're talking about, and to read, and goodness knows the Democratic Party certainly deserves to be beaten up at any possibility, but every time I hear that, I think about voter suppression. So I can be moved and believe as an Americanist, as a scholar and a citizen, in many of these ideas. I would do anything I could to foster them. But I think first we really have to talk about voter suppression and the fact of what is happening in the Justice Department and the fact that we already are looking at changes in voting rights that have been critical to American citizens and their right to vote. This isn't about my voice should be louder or if we just had more dollars. We're really talking about the exercise of citizenship in the United States. And for me right now, that is the thing that I care about deeply. But secondarily, what I also said is we want people to vote because they believe that there's something to vote for, because some of the drop-off in voting that we saw in the 2016 election came from people who felt that they had been so marginalized by the economy that they had no reason to vote. So again, we're looking at a crucial thinker in how to imagine the nation, which we need deeply. And I say that with tremendous respect for you. And I'm just here as a hard-nosed social scientist, even though I don't even do statistics, but as a hard-nosed social scientist saying, let's talk about the right to vote being in danger in this country before we talk about anything
Well,
else.
it's one of the issues that we're dealing with, and we do have to deal with the world as it is, not the world that we wish we could have. So we
Or
have
we should do
powerful
both.
forces.
We should do both.
Well, at this particular moment, I think that we need to deal with the world that we have. But before we come back to you, I would like to ask Larry. You know, I'm a little bit of a literalist. When we talk about a conversation and we talk about voice, there's individual voices, there's a synagogue's voice. What is the role of the synagogue in, for example, doing what Riv-Ellen is talking about, taking some kind of social action to exercise the Jewish voice in something that a synagogue thinks is important? Where is that? Frankly, I haven't heard much since in the last year from synagogues on a collective basis about what's going on.
I didn't expect that question.
That's my specialty.
But so, yeah, well, you are a good questioner. All right. First of all, I tried to address the issue of what religions have to add to the public conversation. That did not address the issue of what's justice and what we ought to be doing. And one of the things Judaism, I think all forms of Judaism, does say is that what we do matters. We're a religion of doing, and the halakha or whatever ethics are, and we may differ on any of those, but at least we do things. So what we say is one thing, what we do is another. We go and we do we follow our conscience. Congregations are organizations that develop a common conscience and that develop, therefore, a larger ability to act in the world than what any individual has. Congregations also, however, have a variety of voices and develop a conversation among them. And that will ultimately lead to what we do. Ideally, however, congregations recognize the diversity within them. And even within Judaism, congregations recognize that we have different ways of talking to one another. All the more so then in the public square. We have our group and somebody else's group. There's so many more conversational voices. So my question is, how are we going to talk to one another? Even as we go about doing what we think our conscience is. The congregation will exercise its conscience and should, and has a major role in doing it because a group can exercise a greater impact than any given individual. But at the same time, it's important, I think, for a conversation to develop a public ability to speak clearly and to listen. And my question is, what is that ability? What are we saying? My point simply is that if we are saying truths, then I'm right and you're wrong, or you're right and I'm wrong, and we can only decide that we'll hunker down and we'll prove each other wrong. That's not a conversation, that's an argument, and it gets us nowhere. If, however, we think that what we speak is imagery and artistry and different ways of thinking about the truth, then I get to listen to you differently, because your picture doesn't look like my picture, but it's a picture. Congregations then do two things. On the one hand, they allow us to act together in ways that any individual can't and have more impact than any individual can. And at the same time, they ought to develop our ability, our artistry, to speak differently, to listen better, and to develop a higher level of offering imagery that impacts others beyond ourselves.
Yes, the idea of we talk beyond each other. One person has one truth, and one person has another truth. There are some things that are objectively true, and some things aren't, and we are being confronted with objective untruths every day. And so, Rich, how do you deal with this world? The world of Donald Trump.
The world
when
I'm
you want to
dealing
be up here,
is Eastern Kentucky.
And he's down here. How do you do that?
Well, let me tell you about Eastern Kentucky, because that's the world I'm dealing with, right?
Okay.
The world I'm dealing with is Eastern Kentucky that voted 70% for Donald Trump, that according to all of our preconceived notions and biases, we would have a list of characteristics of the people who might live there. But here's the real world they live in. They have an opioid crisis. They have more people dying from drug overdose than are dying in any other way in our country. It's happening in states throughout our nation. We have a fundamental choice in the real world, not in an ideal world, because I don't have time for ideals, because people are dying, kids aren't getting good education, people don't feel safe walking down their streets. And the question for folks in Eastern Kentucky is, how do we come together and solve this problem in a way that makes sense? Now, we can have an abstract conversation about that, we can have a conceptual conversation about that, but what I can tell you is when people get in a room and start talking about it and not pointing fingers at one another, and not taking positions as Larry's suggesting, which is a self-righteous position when people believe they are right and everyone else is wrong. But when we can actually frame a discussion about what kind of community do we want to live in and what is it going to take for us to ensure that not another individual dies from an opioid overdose, then I can tell you people actually can come to some common ground about what they want to do. Do they believe and agree on everything? No. Is the religious community helping them come together? No, it's actually dividing them even further. Without a question, they're one of the biggest challenges in that community. But are they able to come together and define some set of common aspirations and some common pathway forward that enables them to have some deeper sense of possibility about their futures? Absolutely. That's the real world. We can decide whether or not we will get mired in arguing over everything that's happening around us. This is what I believe in the real world. Or we can choose to begin to solve problems in our local communities, which is where greater trust exists, greater relationships exist, people can kick the tires on things. And we can rebuild our sense of belief in one another and our sense of can-do spirit and begin to change things. But, last thing I'll say, because I know I'm short on time here, but if we insist on taking on every national issue that is unsolvable and intractable at the moment, we will remain mired in going nowhere. And I think we have a choice in our country right now. Do we want to remain mired in going nowhere, or do we want to start taking action on issues that actually affect people's lives? I choose the latter.
One more question. I'm going to ask Larry a question, and then we'll go to these, I think. Do you think we live in a world where we can, in this country right now, can we do what you're talking about? What can we do what Rich is talking about? I know we can do what Riv-Ellen is talking about. We can focus on a single issue. Can we get people in a room? I know you do it on the local level. But we do face it. We face a crisis in Washington that's not the local level that we can't really ignore. So you're saying we can ignore it?
No, I'm saying that the way in which we're going to make the most progress in Washington, D.C. is by demonstrating action locally that rolls up into a greater force and a greater sense of what is possible in this country. And that, I'll just say lastly, if there's a single lesson from American history, it is that when people get together in local communities and start to create change, it always rolls up to larger change in our society. It seldom comes from Washington, D.C. on its own.
What do you think we can do what you're talking about?
Well, I think I spent a better part of my life, fortunately, to none of my own virtue, but purely through happenstance, sitting down and talking to people who believe different things than I do. I mean, I've taught at the University of Notre Dame, and I heard people making sentences made no sense to me whatsoever. And I thought that they were just wrong, obviously, and I couldn't believe that they believed what they believe. I've been in Protestant settings as well. I worked for the Navy for a year, and I met mostly evangelicals working for the Navy, you know, pastors, right, who said things that just stunned me. Some of them hadn't met Jews. I mean, they couldn't believe what I had to say. So either I have to say I'm right and they're wrong, in which case, goodbye, nice knowing you. Or else I sit down and I say, what are you talking about? I really want to know deeper. And then they begin telling me their stories. I mean, they tell me a story about why whatever they said made sense to them. I still may not agree with the way they frame it, but what their story moves me. And when they use a word or an expression, and I say, that's interesting. And I use one and they say, why did you say that? At least we're in a conversation. So I think even as we move forward and do the things that we have to do for justice and so on, and we do believe that, and even as we insist that there are absolute truths, I'm not a relativist at all. I think things are right or things are wrong. Gravity actually happens, you know. But even as I would insist on that, I also think it is enormously enlightening to ourselves, and we go deeper into ourselves, Also, if you just listen to other people and ask them, why do you say that? Why do you believe it? Now, if we think that what they're saying must be either right or wrong, it's a zero-sum game, then it's all over at the start. We have to prove we're right. That's it. But if we imagine that we're just sharing stories and different ways of talking, but the one thing that we do share, which is the human condition, then I'm able to listen to them and they can listen to me, and we begin making common sentences, and at least nod, and we can say, that is really interesting. I'll take that home with me. So I think at the same time as we do what we have to do, exercising our prophetic conscience, we also can, in fact, further conversations across divides and help ourselves and others understand that these different ways of telling stories about the human condition are enormously enriching one to the other.
I'm interested, Riv-Ellen, if you feel that there's a tension between what you were talking about, which is that sometimes there's people with whom you have nothing in common, and you need to go and find your allies to exercise your voice, and what they're saying about bringing it. Is there a tension in that?
So just a couple of thoughts. So I would like to mention the First Amendment. For as long as we do have a separation of church and state, I do not want congregations to be the place that we do politics. But I think what congregations can do, and I think Larry alluded to this in effective ways, I can tell you about in my own community. It started at the level of leadership is between rabbis and imams. They study together. We, in my own community, we are joined on Sukkot every year by a number of Muslim groups, and we join them, as many of us do, at the end of Ramadan. And some of that was very challenging around Middle Eastern politics. But with the election of Trump, with a very powerful sense of each of our communities really facing dangers of one or another kind, there's just more and more opportunities for connections with one another, and not just among its leadership, but in a lot of different ways, women's groups, other groups. And this really follows, I think, on what Larry is trying to say, which is how can a religious community address political issues in some sense? It's with that kind of shared humanity, shared time together, which when one or another of our communities have experienced attacks on mosques or attacks on Jewish schools, we have been in the forefront of responding to one another. It's a really wonderful example of something we would not specifically call political, but of course it is political. But more importantly, it's about building very important connections on which we are not going to always agree. I think what Rich is saying, I think Rich and I probably don't really disagree very much, but we are really talking about what can happen at various levels. And I think the hardest part of this conversation is that we can't mush all the levels with one another. What happens around a community problem like opioids, which is a tragedy, particularly in the places that were most powerfully supportive of Trump, but about which we all share a lot of compassion and concern and that sort of other thing. I love that work. I think it's crucial, but neither am I willing to tell you that I think voter suppression is only a Washington problem. I think it's a problem in every district. So just as we move through this incredibly important conversation, just remember, we're talking about different issues at different levels, and I don't want politics done in this building because I am really supportive of the separation of church and state. By the way, I come from the state of Minnesota where Michelle Bachmann prayed with a community of evangelicals about whether or not she should announce, and she announced in her church, and I don't support that. I think this is an issue we should all be very frightened about.
So the issue of the issue of voter suppression, you don't think that's politics?
Do I think that's politics?
Yeah.
I'm trying to say I think that's local. I think
Do you think that's political?
State. Of course I think it's political, but I'm not willing, not to be too argumentative, which I am notorious for.
Me too.
I am not willing to say that opioids is an important community level problem and voter suppression is some kind of a
You don't
national
think
one.
isn't that a political problem, opioid?
I'm sorry?
Isn't the opioid crisis political?
It's political in a small p way in the sense that how we solve problems collectively is is a notion of politics. That's what politics really essentially is about, is how we solve problems and create the kinds of lives we want. And that there are some things that we can only do together, that we can only achieve together. And that's what politics was invented for. And so my argument is this, that there are things that are necessary. I agree with Riv on voter suppression. Not a single individual should be turned away from casting their ballot during an election.
No, right. I understand that. But my point is that we like to say we want to keep politics out of all this. But politics is how this country runs. Politics is...
Well, I think there's a difference between what Americans have come to understand as politics, meaning the polarization of political parties.
Right, but that's not... Just because that's the understanding, that doesn't make it true.
Well,
and so the opioid
it makes it part of the reality.
Is also a capital P problem. It's not just a small problem.
It is,
right?
It is. But I think my point on the opioids is this, that right now we can't, it's very difficult. I would love to find a way to solve the polarization problem in Congress. But here's what I know. I know we can solve it locally on the opioid crisis. Notwithstanding... No, but communities can come together and start to work on this, notwithstanding the real politics that are involved in it. And I think that's an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we can come together and get things done.
I think sometimes people use, the notion of politics. Oh, we can't do that because it's politics as an excuse not to get involved.
I'm not saying.
I'm
that.
not suggesting. I know you're
I'm
not,
but
I really know you're not. All right, let's start with your voices. This is for Larry. Where was the rabbinate during the election when Christian clergy were so vocal? What specifically should rabbis and other Jewish leaders be doing now?
You sure that's for me? I mean,
It says it's for you. I would have given it to you anyway, but this person wants you to answer it.
So tell me again, where was the rabbinate?
Where was the rabbinate during the election when Christian clergy were so vocal? What specifically should rabbis and other Jewish leaders be doing now, presumably about the Trump crisis?
Well, if I knew that, we wouldn't have to meet here. I think that's complicated and also simple. Complicated because I don't know exactly what rabbis should do or what priests should do or what anybody individually should do. It's a complicated matter. I know that we need to speak our conscience, and I think rabbis need to do that and have done that. If I collected any number of great sermons, of which Rabbi Zemmel's is right at the top of the list, people who actually spoke out recently and did so profoundly. And those sermons now are circulated widely, and I think they're changing people's position. I think they're having an impact. So I do think rabbis should speak out. But as your own rabbi and other rabbis said, and this goes to politics, there's a difference between addressing an issue, addressing that is to say a moral concern on one hand, and actually taking aim verbally and directly and obviously at a political party or at a political person. Now, clearly, if I favor a particular policy or if I say anything about my tradition, someone is going to say, but you're opposed to that particular person. That may be. That's only because, however, that particular person takes a different position than I do on the issue. These are issues, moreover, of action. And there, what I said before, I'm with Riv-Ellen in that. When it comes to action, we have to do what our conscience tells us. And the role of rabbis is to help us do that.
Do you agree with the premise of the first question, that the rabbinate was quiet while the Christian clergy was vocal during the election? I mean, that's the premise of the question.
I think that there's a mistake in the premise. It depends on which Christian clergy we're talking about and which rabbis we're talking about. There are, I don't know how many, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Christian clergy. Those who spoke out on the right received a lot of publicity. Those who didn't may not have received any publicity at all. There were lots of rabbis who did, in fact, speak out. Did they make, you would know better than I mean, you're the one who knows how newspapers work. But the real question is, who gets the publicity? And what actually is our understanding of what people did? I think it became complicated, however, I will say, for liberal rabbis. And that is because liberal rabbis started with the assumption, to some extent, that there should not be a religious voice in the public square. And that is because, since the 1970s, the religious voice in the public square has been the conservative voice. And so our native assumption that there's something wrong with a religious voice actually means we liberals think there's something wrong with the conservative religious voice because they're winning and we're not. So what we've tried to do is fight a rearguard action and say, no voices in the public square, religions stay out. What I began by saying is that they were to have a voice. That's a lost cause, it's bad policy, it's bad politics, and I think, in fact, not just on tactical grounds, but on grounds of belief. I think religion belongs in the public square. So I took out a whole paragraph on this because I only had 8 minutes. I began by actually assuming there should be a voice in the public square. And what I want to do is make the various voices possible. How do we therefore speak with different voices in the public square legitimately? I want to allow liberal clergy especially to see themselves with a role in the public square without feeling that they are somehow thereby encouraging just the right. I think the public square has barely been touched by liberals. To that extent, I think the questioner is right. And I think we have a long way to go.
Okay. We have a guest.
This is all choreographed. Okay. I have a question for each one of you. And I think, Larry, the question I think is a continuation. What do we do? What do we need to learn? What do we need to learn to do in order to tell our stories, our religious story, in a compelling way in the public square so that it will be heard? I feel like there's something that we're not doing well in the liberal religious community. And what are the forms? What does it look like? What does it feel like when the story is told in a compelling way? Where is it heard? Where does it take place? How does it happen? Rich, my question for you is, we've talked about this a lot. I think we agree that social change, that's the word I'll use, social change drives political change, okay, in terms of the way we're using the word politics. And I worry that we don't have that kind of time. And how long does it take? For Riv-Ellen, I agree. Voter suppression is everything. I've been trying to get my religious movement to understand that. I've been trying to get the Religious Action Center where my daughter works to understand that voter suppression is everything, that we need a nationally organized religious movement that says we the people, that the way we express human dignity in this country as American citizens is everybody has a right to vote, and the platform is such that everybody cares. What would you suggest that we do to create that environment where action is actually taken that's productive, both locally and nationally? Because I think it is critical. It underscores so much.
Thank you for all of that. I would add one other thing. I would actually ask you a question, which you can. When you asked Larry, you said to tell our story. What's our story?
I said stories.
Okay, that's different. Okay. Do you remember the question he asked you?
I do remember it.
Go.
I do remember it. We were joking before about getting to a certain age where you forget things, but I remember that. First of all, I want to not amend, but emphasize one part of the answer to the last question. As I think about what I said, I was working my way to an answer. I think the questioner is more right than wrong. And that is because, as I got to at the end, liberals are afraid to speak, and I want to encourage, empower liberals to speak. The way to speak is, first of all, by having these one-on-one meetings and these conversations with other people. Now to the question, how we tell our story, our stories, right? I will give you an example. When I was at the University of Notre Dame, I found myself sitting around a table with a bunch of theologians, some of them very famous, who were talking about their interpretation of the New Testament and of the Church Fathers and of Christian experience. I almost didn't understand what they were talking about most of the time. I'd never had that conversation. But at some point, I realized that I'd been there for several months, and I actually began to clue in a little bit into what they were saying. This is a conversation in a million years I never would have thought I'd be part of. And at one point, I said to the theologian on my right, aha, I said, that is your life in Christ. And he said, yes. And I said to him, I don't know what I just said. In other words, I knew how to speak Catholic. I knew what the right response was. What I had got from him over spending a lot of time was, I knew he had an image of a life in Christ. And rather than poo-pooing it or deciding that, oh, that's silly, or I don't believe it, or I don't know, I don't believe in Christ, I could think of a lot of answers. I decided he was on to something from his experience. I wanted to know what it was. And I probed him and I asked him. And then the result was he asked me what would be the equivalent in my Jewish experience. I didn't have an answer. No one had asked me before. But because I was in this dialogue, I got a different question than I would have had, and I began talking about the life of Torah. And then he began saying, oh, that's what Torah is, huh? Now, out of that, there emerged, first of all, an ability to talk with one another, because we had two different images of the same kind of thing, it turned out. But secondly, I was getting my story straight. One of the ways you get your story straight is to have conversations with people who don't know it and will ask you what it is. And then you realize most of what you want to say you didn't know before because no one ever asked you. And when they ask you, then you say, gee, I don't know, I got to think about it. Now, I can imagine a scenario where each of us, make this up, we're at Temple Micah. I can imagine a scenario where each person here says, I'm going to find somebody in a different religious community. I'm going to have a conversation of what do you believe most and think about best. And then I'm going to make a note of the questions they ask me. And then I'm going to get together with another 10 people and say, here are the questions I didn't know the answer to. And I can imagine now a dialogue among the 10 people in each of these groups saying, oh, that's my story. We don't get our story straight because we don't have a conversation. And we don't have conversations because we don't know how to have conversations anymore. And we don't know how to have conversations anymore because we don't know how to speak differently. And we're afraid of being embarrassed. We're too much the adult saying, I don't want to talk about things I don't know anything about. I don't know, don't ask me. I think we need to have more conversations on a congregational level with other people from other congregations, probing the things that we never get to talk about, and then trying to think through what are the Jewish ways of speaking about this. And the result is an enormous depth for each of us and our ability now to enter the public square in ways we never could.
Well, that was great. You just answered the question I was going to ask.
for
Somebody
one.
had asked, brilliant. The question was, how can we as American Jews reach out to those who reject us as elitists, our positions on immigration and race, without abandoning our responsibility to stand up for the oppressed? And you spoke about how to go about having these conversations. Riv-Ellen, you want to answer Danny's question?
So I didn't come here to talk about voter suppression. And just off the top of my head, in this Washington, D.C. congregation, I bet there are 5 people who would have a better an answer to the question than I would. And frankly, it's a political answer about what organizations you support, where you put yourself at polling places, how you go about doing that. But I think that's a more organizational question. So, and similarly, I'm not in the leadership of any religious movement where I think there are ways to have this conversation, but time is brief, and that this is not what as I said, I'd love to talk to anybody afterwards in your community who might have something to say, so I'm going to pass on to Rich's question, which is a profound question that he has to answer. Well, it's a very powerful question about time.
I think there are a couple of different ways to think about this. One is the way I think about where we are right now is as a nation, we're at an impasse. We're at loggerheads. And the question is, how do you move through an impasse, right? And so I think one of the ways in which you move through an impasse at a national level is that we commit ourselves to supporting people who are speaking sense, that we believe are speaking sense, that we believe have some public spirit in what they're saying. And in many cases, we may not agree with ideologically or even from their positions, but we believe that they have integrity and that they're trying to make the public square work. And I think more than anything right now, we need to invest in making the public square work. So on a national level, what I would say is, how do we support those individual leaders, those organizations, those groups that are seeking to make the public square work? At the same time, to Ravel's points, which I agree with, there are times when you have to go into action and mobilize and argue your point. To me, that's necessary but not sufficient. The sufficient part is that we need to mobilize around people we believe are of goodwill and good intention. That's number one. Number two, in a larger scheme, if you look at the scope of history and how communities and societies change, the ways in which we move out of impasses is we create alternative forces for the public good. So I want to connect this to Larry's point. In those places where I've seen this work, like in Alabama where I was, where everyone was locked into their position on education, right? You had conservatives for charter schools, you had liberals, you had all sorts of groups. When I was able to change the conversation to what kind of community are you really trying to create and what do you believe children deserve in your communities, they could move off those positions and begin to articulate a different sense of how to move forward as a community or a state. Now, that's not a singular public voice, but it is a public voice that becomes an alternate force to politics as usual, to go back to Valerie's point, to politics as usual, because we need forces against that. But that's not enough. I think in addition to that, because you're asking how do we accelerate social change, one of the things that I think we need to pay more attention to, and this also goes to stories, is that there are a lot of actions happening in local communities that are invisible to us. They're only visible to those who are working on them. I can take you to Mississippi, to small towns in Mississippi where people are coming together who are strange bedfellows across political spectrums, who are ensuring that kids 0 to 5 get off to a healthy start, right? None of us would ever imagine that, but it's happening. But we never talk about it. We don't make it visible. So I think one of the things that we need to do in our society is we need to make more visible those things that are invisible to us, that hold value to us. And when we make them visible, we then need to begin to understand how to talk about them in a form that creates an alternate narrative that runs counter to the dominant narrative that tells us we ought not to believe in ourselves, we ought not to come together to try to find common ground, we ought not to take shared responsibility for our communities, we ought not to have a can-do spirit in our country. Because I believe when we start to make these things visible and talk about them in a more intentional way, we can begin to take a different path and accelerate the social change that you're talking about.
Thank you. I'm going to crunch a couple of these. This place that you talked about that we're in, where people feel they have no dignity, they feel they've been left beside, it doesn't just happen starting in November. It's been going on. You've been walking for 30 years, you said, right? And I think there's actually a great book written by a New York Times columnist I think it's called The Unwinding of America. It's talked about the last 30, 40 years of this unwinding. And yet you talk about these people coming together in Mississippi, but we don't talk about them. Yet people are coming together in these places, so here's somebody's asking, what have these folks been able to agree on to solve the opioid crisis? You were talking about folks coming together in Eastern Kentucky.
That is just starting. I think what they're
Okay.
But what I can tell you is in Mobile, Alabama, where they didn't pass a school levy for 40 years, where the Chamber of Commerce started $1 million public relations campaigns to try to convince people to support the schools, which they wouldn't, where everyone said that blacks and whites in that county would never agree with one another, and that rich and poor would never agree with one another, and that urban, rural, and suburban would always disagree about education.
Right.
That when they came together and had a different conversation, not about their entrenched positions, not about their religious positions, not about some self-righteous point of view about who's right and who's wrong, but about what they wanted to create, what happened there? They went from the lowest performing schools to the top performing schools in Alabama. Right? They started STEM education. They got teachers who would not go to rural areas in Mobile County and incentivize them differently, and now they've got a much better distribution of teachers across that county. So it can be done. The unwinding of America, it's no question that it has happened. It has gotten worse over the last 30, 40 years. And my point is that it has moved from a purely political topic to a more profound cultural issue about our human condition. And that's troubling. It also provides us an enormous opportunity because the human condition is easier to talk about and work on than politics as usual, where we entrench ourselves and dig into our positions.
So in the last 30, 40 years, have we heard a Jewish voice in the public square? Has there been one?
A what?
A Jewish voice. Larry?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of Jewish voices. The most obvious one is the Religious Action Center, the RAC, where they do nothing but try to develop a Jewish voice. There are different kinds. Remember I said, though, there are different publics? I mean, that's really important. Look, I could have simply addressed the kind of obvious things about all the great things Judaism has to say, and then you'd all go home and you'd say, yeah, we sure need Jews talking in the public square. Good Judaism's got things to say. And I could have done that for sure, but I'm trying to do something a little more profound, a little deeper. I'm trying to say, first of all, there are many different publics. The voice you offer differs depending upon the public. So on the one hand, you ask me, are there rabbis who's the first question, which is an excellent one, and now we come back to it. Are there rabbis? Are there Jewish voices in the public square? Sure. The RAC, for example, is in the public square. It's all they do, constantly. I mean, I know some of the things that Danny's been doing and other rabbis here in other cities. I could point to that. What I'm saying is that we don't have a profound enough understanding of the public square to recognize, guess what? We're all in it. Right. We're all in the public square. I mean, they may not know your voice and put it in the newspaper, and it's not as if you've got your own community that you can call together and so on. You don't have that position. But every day of the week, you know somebody you can talk to. And it happens locally, as Rich says. So each of us has a voice. We also may think that we don't have a voice that knows anything about Judaism. Who am I to talk about it? And I grant you, a lot of us don't know enough. But you know what? You can simply tell your story. You can find out, the way I said before, what are people saying? What do they think most profoundly about? And the key is not to feel on the defensive. So I meet somebody who says to me, well, quite frankly, I think you're not saved unless you believe in Jesus Christ. So I could say that's the end of the conversation, or I could say that's really interesting. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by saved? Right? And tell me why you believe in Christ. That's fascinating to me. The other person's now interested and I'm interested. And the next thing you know, there's a conversation. It turns out we differ on the picture we use. But guess what? We all want to be saved. We all want to be, maybe we don't use that word. We all want to be, have a better life. We all hope there's something in the beyond. We all want to matter more than we ever thought we could. I mean, think of different ways of putting it. But those are different ways of speaking. So I'm trying to say each of us can have a voice as who we are. I don't want to just talk about the particular people out there, because it's not about it there. It's really about in here.
Could I add something to what Larry said, why I think this is especially important? There are a remarkable number of people who would like to speak for Jews and who would like to tell us what an appropriate Jewish response is to a variety of issues, largely international ones. And they rarely actually represent the attitudes of most Jews. They rarely speak for anyone but a kind of institutional group or something like that. And I think that's also something really to keep in mind. This is true even among evangelicals. For example, there's a profound environmental evangelical movement that is largely of younger evangelicals. So we just need to know that whenever someone claims or a group claims to speak for everyone, I mean, that is driven by all sorts of things. And I think where I began is exactly what Larry just said, which is you need to find your own Jewish voice. You need to speak from it. Obviously, there are institutional Jewish voices. The RAC is very interesting. But again, don't forget the First Amendment. The RAC can't endorse and shouldn't endorse, because we need really to keep religion out of the public square insofar as religion means the endorsement of particular political candidates. And I think voter suppression is a really important issue. Guess what other issue I think is really, really important? And that is what is being done in the Trump administration to, for example, forbid abortion protected by the Constitution of immigrants in detention today. Don't lose sight of really what a dangerous moment we're living in that way too. Danny invited me here as the optimist, so I just really want to take my place at the table. Sorry.
I think I'm looking at some of these questions, and I think a number of people don't know how to start the conversations with other people you're talking about. So maybe it's up to the synagogues to create these conversations within them. How do you speak to them? How do you reach out to other? Maybe that's the way to do it, because a lot of people are saying, how do we talk? How do we actually? What do we say? Where do you begin? I mean, it's you all are very privileged people. You get around, you get to talk to whoever you want. But other people can't just say, oh, I want to talk to an evangelical tomorrow, and where are you going to find one? Oh, well, Danny can, but you guys can. So, Riv-Ellen, here's a question. How should we think about the Jewish voice in a time of rising anti-Semitism? Is the Jewish voice any different in this time? Is it more defensive? Is it explanatory? What is?
So I actually think that's a really profound question. And I told you this wonderful example in my own community of the Twin Cities of Minnesota, where Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders and Muslim lay people and Jewish lay people have found things to talk about in terms of the anti-Semitism and Islamophobia of the moment that we're in. What I do think is that we have every reason to be very much on guard against anti-Semitism, to understand that many people claim not to be anti-Semitic who are, particularly on the alt-right and in sort of other dimensions. But it's a complicated issue because of the conjunction of international politics and local politics. But anyone who speaks in the language of Nazism, neo-Nazism as it's called, or the language of the alt-right, or frankly, the language of racism, those are things that I think we need to be engaged in, vigilant in, and to not be afraid. So that's a short answer to a really large.
Either of you want to jump
Well,
on that?
I do want to say something, and that is that in matters like anti-Semitism, we Jews need allies. We could, but it would be foolish to fight it alone, as if, oh my God, the whole world's against us. The whole world isn't against us. In fact, most of America is not anti-Semitic. Most Americans hate anti-Semitism. But if we are not able to tell our stories and share stories with others, then we're not going to build allies. And all the canards about Jews then will go unanswered. The way to answer them, by the way, is not necessarily only publicly, though I think we have to do that too. But I think we need to be working at the local level in the local public square to tell our stories and to build allies so that people who differ us on all sorts of things understand what we talk about when we mean anti-Semitism and say, you know, you're right about that. That now is not just your problem, that becomes my problem. And you know what, I got problems in my schools or my opioid crisis or, you know, whatever. And we say, you know what, I didn't understand the depth of that. That's now my problem too. Let's share each other's problem because both of us have common enemies. There are people who actually don't belong in the public square because there are people who want to destroy the public square. There are people who are just hate mongers, and that's not what America stands for, and that's not how you have any conversation at all. But they are actually the common enemy of 9/10 or 99/100 of Americans. We need to have those conversations, if only to get the boundaries straight and to build coalitions on the local level as well.
Do you find anti-Semitism when you're going to Mississippi and Tennessee? People say,
Do I find anti-Semitism?
I mean,
when I go to
does it
Mississippi and Tennessee?
impede your work?
Look, I find racism, anti-Semitism, all sorts of challenges across our country. And I think what I would say is that I wouldn't ascribe it to a certain region of our country and believe that it only exists there. It exists among us wherever there are people. I think to the 2 points that were made, look, this is one of the things I was saying in terms of there are many, many groups in our society who are aggrieved, who believe that they have been sold a raw deal, who believe they've been sold a narrative that the economy has improved while their lives have gotten worse, who believe that they fear, if you're Muslim, that you fear because of terrorism internationally that someone's going to harm you locally, right? To Larry's point, Ravel's point, these aggrieved groups actually share more in common. There are things that divide them. There is no question about it. We can't be naive about this or Pollyannish about it. But there are things that bring us together across these groups that if we were willing to change the conversation, if we were willing to listen differently, if we were willing most fundamentally to ask a different question, then I think we would find common cause with more people in our country and not feel so pushed into a corner without any options for creating a sense of possibility for ourselves and others. And I think that's the real work that America needs to do right now.
Thank you. We are at the point in our program where we're going to start to wrap up. So we're going to have each of them come 2 minutes, say whatever it is you wish you had said before. Here's your chance. Here's your last chance to say what you want. Riv-Ellen, you want to start? Oh, we're starting the other way. I'm sorry.
Yes, we're going to start with Larry.
Yes.
Well, I'll start with a story that's appropriate for everything I said. When I was in Alabama, you mentioned Alabama, some years ago, a long time ago, I was quite young and quite immature and quite naive about everything. And I went down to give a talk in Alabama, and lo and behold, it was to a series of mostly Protestant, mostly African-American clergy. And we had first a little bit of food, first of all, and then one man, an elderly man it seemed to me, probably younger than I am now, but oh well, came up and said to me, "So you won't try, I won't do the drawl, I'm not good at it, and I don't want it to come off as if I'm making fun or something," but he said to me, "So," he said, "you're from the East, huh?" I said, "Yes." "From New York, huh?" "Yes," I said. He nodded and he said, "I'll give you some advice." "Yes," I said. He said, "This is what you got to remember when you talk to us." Us. He says, "Here's your lesson. We talk dumb, but we ain't." Bingo. I learned something that day. And I realized I was never going to treat anybody else as if they were a moron, if they're not worth talking to. They got nothing to teach me, or they'll never understand it. What do they know? The fact of the matter is, I find that most people they may not have book knowledge. I mean, I'm not talking about now the preachers. People may not have book knowledge, but they've got knowledge. There are a lot of people who have knowledge. Everybody does because they have a life. You can't go through life without having knowledge. I tell my students, all of my students have to write what I call a autobiographical theology. I tell them they think they don't know what they don't know. They think, hey, they know what Martin Buber said. They know what Mordecai Kaplan said. They know what Heschel said. They know theology. They don't. They know other people's theology. And I say, the one thing you're an expert in is your own life. But you never talk about your own life in a serious way because you're afraid to take yourself seriously. So talk about your own life. What do you know for sure? What for sure do you doubt? What do you think matters most? Now imagine that you were a theologian. Put that into some talk about God. You never talked about God before, I know. Try it. You'll like it. And in fact, people stutter and they stumble and eventually they come out with a different kind of story about their life. You see? It's all about what register do you want to use? What vocabulary do you want to use? And out comes now this stuff about, well, I guess God is, or for me, I don't believe in God, but I think about this. You can make up the rest of it. And it's fascinating. So I think everybody's got that story in them, and yet no one encourages them to say it because we're afraid to have deep conversations, because we're afraid we'll be wrong, we're afraid we'll be proven stupid. We remember when we were kids, then we had to do it. The teacher made us. But now we're adults and we read, we read all the great newspapers and and now we know better than to put ourselves in a situation where we might have to say, gulp, I really don't know. But there's nothing more profound than taking your life seriously. I happen to believe that religion is about taking your life seriously. And in so doing, taking the life of the universe seriously and the life of everybody else seriously. And there's nothing like having a serious conversation about stuff you don't really know about in that language, but you know about it because it's your own life. That's my first thing. The second thing is I want to give you a model. The worst model is to assume that religions tell truths, and therefore, if I'm right, they're wrong. I don't think Christ is the Son of God, therefore the people who think he is are idiots. I can't imagine how anybody can believe that, you name it, you know? Because they think I'm an idiot. What's the matter with me? You Jews didn't accept it? All right? That's the way of hatred, and that's the way of warfare. But if we treat it differently, as artistry of the finest order, and we imagine that the great challenge of life is to make a brilliant art piece of who we are, and to keep that art piece going and touching it up, and you look at it and say, that's who I am. Now imagine each community. Here's my model. It's not a model of religious groups that hate each other and think that the other guy's all wrong, not worth talking to. It's a model of a museum or an art gallery, better. And each religious group has its own room. And they spend their time in the room kind of decorating and redecorating. You've done that in your house. Now it turns out they don't all agree in the decoration either. So, you know, the Orthodox are that wall, and the Reform got that wall, and there too there's differences. But what makes us all Jews is we're all working with Torah and some of the same imagery and so on. And so we kind of separate walls, but we got our room. Every once in a while, we go into the hall, and we meet somebody from the Muslim community or the Christian community or whatever, and we say, I'd love to see your room. And we look at their room and say, why did you do that? Say, that's gorgeous. I don't get this. What's that image? And they tell us their story. And we walk back out into the hall and we say, that was lovely. I wonder if I have anything like that. Or maybe I learned something from them, you know? Maybe I got something similar. What can I do in my room? Look, to be human is to live the human condition. To be part of a congregation of any sort is to get together because you want to learn what that tradition is and make the most of it and go deeply yourself into it someday before you die. And you want to leave something for the people you love behind. We're all doing that together. If you can imagine ourselves occupying a Jewish room and realizing how much we have to gain by going into the hall and talking to someone else and coming back and getting our stories straight, we will live much deeper lives. We'll avoid the antagonisms that have gone into the human race for these how many thousands of years, and we will be able to build at least stories that can be told together, even though we may differ on issues. We will build stories together about the human condition which we all share, and that, I think, is the function of the public square.
And that is why Larry Hoffman is a revolutionary Jewish thinker.
So I want to thank both of my colleagues for very powerful reminders of the centrality of dignity in all that we do, and the possibility of, at local levels, around shared struggles, that the connections that have seemed impossible in this moment are really possible. And I feel very enriched as an individual by these conversations. And I want to leave with what became so important to me as I thought through much of what I've been reading and reflecting on lately, and that is the centrality of justice. And I say that because we are living in a moment really developed since the late 70s, in which the extraordinary gains of the 60s and early 70s and late 50s are being dismantled every hour of every day before our eyes. And Donald Trump unleashed the possibility of two crucial things: the possibility of speaking a language of hatred, long suppressed, that people now feel able to speak through, which is very powerful. And he has unleashed a complete lack of confidence in truth, in fact, and in science that has put all of us at tremendous risk. So the impact on people of color, the impact on immigrants, the impact on women's rights and the rights of many others is really, really, to my mind, the most important thing that we have to address. And as those problematic, cosmopolitan, overeducated people that we are, we have every responsibility every day of our lives to ask the question of justice and to ask the question of a common good that is built on science, empiricism, and fact that we cannot desist from struggling with. And that's what I'd like to leave you with.
Going last was a really bad idea.
You're not going last, Danny's going last.
Oh, good. Well, being the penultimate one is a really bad idea. So I started with one idea, but as I've listened to my two colleagues, here's where I've ended up. I want to pick up on this notion of risk, because I think Riv-Ellen was really eloquent in talking about the risk that has evolved since the 1970s, and as you were saying, Valerie, the unwinding of America. Look, I think there are two conditions in our country that we get to choose how we're going to deal with. One is our sense of alienation, our sense of frustration, the sense of a loss of dignity among and between too many of us, a sense that we've lost our voice in the public square, a sense that we've lost the capability to come to any sense of common ground, as narrow as it might be at any particular moment. That's condition number one. I think we get to make a choice about how we deal with that. We can hunker down, we can retreat, we can hide from it, or we can decide to make ourselves visible, step forward, and engage with it. I think we need to choose, obviously, the latter. The second condition is this, that many of the challenges that we face in our society today require collective responses. We can't do it on our own. Whether it's the education work that you report on daily, or the opioid crisis, or the discrimination and anti-Semitism and anti-refugee sentiments that are in a lot of communities, all of these challenges required a shared responsibility. And so when you put those two things together, we have actually an opportunity to say, we will take a different path for how we will work together, and we will come together to take shared responsibility to address our collective challenges. So that's number one. Number two, I always think it's important to remind ourselves of our history. I believe we're a unique country. We kicked out a hostile landlord called King George. We decided that we wanted to create, right? We're in the creation business in America, much like faiths are in the creation business. We're in the creation business in America, and we decided to create a different kind of country that was rooted in ideals, not monarchies, not caste systems, not how much wealth you had, but in ideals where people were deemed to be equal. And we know darn well that we have lots of stains, ugly stains on our history. But I think it's always important to remind ourselves in the arc of our history that we have consistently dealt with those ugly stains and overcome them. Not as fast as we wanted to, not in the ways that we often should have, but we have worked at it and we have kept going. And to me, the promise of America is something that we need to keep reminding ourselves of. So at this time of what some of us might think of as peril, which I agree with, there are lots of challenges. And I think they're coming not simply from the right, I believe they're often coming from the left as well. I do. But at this time of peril, we would do ourselves well to remind ourselves of our history, to remind ourselves of the promise of this country, to remind ourselves that in this unique time, we get to choose whether or not we will succumb to the politics as usual that we disdain, or whether or not we'll choose a different path. And we get to choose whether or not we will take a shared responsibility to solving our collective problems, or whether or not we will choose to go it alone on our own. Those are choices we get to make that no one gets to choose for us. And I think that's what we need to start concentrating more on.
Thank you. One second. When you talked about our story, actually, I thought you were going to talk about the Jewish story.
Well, I was. And if I could just say one quick amendment to Riv-Ellen's point. So I agree there is no singular Jewish story. My hope would be that our faith, our leaders of our faith, those of us in our faith, all of us, would use our faith not to tell each other what we ought to think, but to call each other forward, to say that we are part of what needs to happen. We are co-creators of this world we live in. We get to choose that, and Judaism or the Jewish faith can instruct us to make ourselves visible, to engage with one another, to account for what we say and do, and to be part of the solution as opposed to retreating from the public square. And because when we retreat, we forfeit the opportunity to shape our common destiny.
I think it's worth noting that Jewish thought has informed the United States, the creation
Absolutely.
and the ability.
Yeah.
So that's where I thought you were going. I thought you were going to go there. I would like to have Rabbi Zemel close this out with his thoughts, his wisdom, his jokes.
Thank you all so much. My wisdom is that we're getting close to 7 o'clock. So first,
And
I
no
want
one left.
What's that? You're right.
And
No
no
one's
one
left.
left.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am deeply appreciative of. I'm left with many, many, many thoughts. I think about the internal Jewish public square and our ability to have our increasingly challenging ability to have constructive conversations amongst ourselves as American Jews. That's an area we did not touch on. Riv-Ellen kind of got close to it in terms of Jewish institutional and organizational life, and sometimes the gap between the Jewish public. It's an area for many of us of increasing concern. I think we do want to learn to tell our stories and find ways to tell our stories in compelling and deeper ways, and relearn what our story is in a way that synthesizes the kind of a new American story with the new Jewish story for the 21st century. As I think a lot about the stories that our grandchildren's grandchildren will tell about our lives and the way we conduct ourselves, as opposed to the stories that we grew up on the immigrant experience, and how what we're doing now will inform the future of Jewish life and American life. I'm also left with an enormous question that I think I'll talk about with Riv-Ellen afterwards. How predictive is social science in terms of the ability to predict? I really, I'm thinking about that a lot in terms of birth rates in Orthodox Judaism and the future of American Jewish life, what we should be thinking about, and how does social science account for the unpredictable and the unexpected? Because life happens not always usually not the way we predict. But mostly, thank you, all of you, so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. I've looked forward to this for so long. 2 more words, or 3 more words. I want to thank the Temple Micah Innovation Fund and everybody that contributes to the Innovation Fund for making this possible. The Innovation Fund's next offering will be this coming May. As we celebrate 70 years of Israel's independence, we will be offering a Sunday afternoon conversation on the future of Israel and the American Jewish mind. And we have 2 great people that we've invited, and I've got a great moderator lined up, so watch for details. I'm not going to tell you about who that is now, but also we'll be continuing this particular conversation about the public square in December, when Rabbi David Saperstein comes here on Sunday morning, December 3rd. His topic is, after I've spoken to him, the effective Jewish voice in the public square. Okay, so thank you all for being with us this afternoon.